Noch nicht. So, I'm very pleased to welcome everybody here in Berlin, live in presence from the Festsaal of the university, of one of the campuses. And of course, I would like to give a warm welcome to all our listeners and participants who are now virtually with us via YouTube. I'm sure you would like to return the welcome, but YouTube doesn't work that way, so we can't hear you, unfortunately, or see you. Anyhow, we will have a very vivid and interesting discussion, I think, today. Two talks on the topic of authority in modernity or alternative authority. With our first speaker, Professor Jacob Olupona, and our second speaker, Almut Shulamit Bruckstein. We will hear the talks one after another, and we'll start with Professor Olupona, whom I'd like to introduce to you right now. Professor Olupona is a professor of African religious traditions with a joint appointment as Professor of African and African American Studies in the Faculty of Arts and Science at Harvard University, or Harvard Divinity School. His current research focuses on the religious practices of the estimated 1 million Africans who have immigrated to the US over the last 40 years. Excuse me. Examining in particular several populations that remain relatively invisible in the American religious landscape. Reverse missionaries who have come to the United States to establish churches, African Pentecostals in American congregations, American branches of independent African churches, and indigenous African religious communities in the United States. His earlier research ranged across African spirituality and ritual practices, spirit possession, Pentecostalism, Yoruba festivals, I hope I pronounced that right, animal symbols, or symbolism, sorry, icons, phenomenology, and religious pluralism in Africa and the Americas. With that, I would like to open the floor for your talk, which is entitled Cultural Imagination and Indigenous African Sources of Authority. Please, Professor Olupona, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stefan. It's a pity I'm not able to be with you at this point, but I'm glad to join you through Zoom. I will read most of my talk, and then I'll probably discuss a couple of things just outside the text. I am fortunate and old enough to remember a time when most African countries, Nigeria included, enjoyed a great nationalist spirit and ideology around the era of independence. This era of cultural nationalism included the study and support of indigenous traditions, such as indigenous political structure, traditional medicine, history, the arts, and so on. And much of the best work in African studies, I would say, was coming out of newly formed universities, such as the University of Ibadan, University of Ife, University of Nigeria, Nsukka, and Ahmadu Bello University, to mention just a few. There was a wonderful sense of respectful collaboration between academics and practitioners of indigenous traditions of all sorts, what we often call town and gown today, specifically in the area of religion. A deep understanding of indigenous religious structures was understood as essential to community building and successful national identity. Some post-independence leaders, such as Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, even used the indigenous tradition as the inspiration for national projects like Ujamaa ideology, which I once argued, and I think my friend in Sweden also argued, Westernon, was the basis of Tanzanian civil religion. Scholars and even politicians understood that the valorization of indigenous traditions could be of great service to national identity and unity without challenging the place of Islam and Christianity. The post-independence era was a reflection of the nation's outlook on our faith traditions, and a form of scholastic unity was built around the common religious ideology of God, was like the central symbol in what we would then call the civil religion. It was important that when a leader mentioned God in his speech, everybody felt he was speaking to them. Furthermore, it was assumed that in order to grow, the nation required a kind of cultural renaissance that embraced plurality. This perspective on plurality, or the creation of a political arena that actively welcomed all religious traditions in a non-competitive manner, was a direct legacy of the indigenous cosmology. But it was sadly taken for granted. And while national politicians engaged Western forms of political organization with their inherited legacy of Christianity, and also spent a great deal of time and effort determining how Islamic forms of law, Sharia, and governance should be integrated into national structures, no such conscious consideration of indigenous tradition was ever materialized. Africans look like people who keep borrowing foreign clothes to wear. And this is part of the crisis we are faced with. And still, in the mid-20th century, Christianity and Islam had been indigenized or articulated through symbols and idioms that were intelligible to indigenous sensibilities, while still remaining quite orthodox. I view this as the golden age of peaceful coexistence in Nigeria, but it was perhaps more than that. Religious diversity was a fact to be celebrated precisely because each religious community brought something unique that could enhance the national identity and abilities of the community. You now know why I was very much interested in this whole theory of civil religion that Bella popularized in America. And allow me to give one example from my childhood experience. I still remember how in the 60s, the entire local community rejoiced when the imam of the town my parents lived in at that time became the first in our area to do the Hajj in Mecca and Medina, bestowing great honor on all of us as we interpreted it at that time. The Christians in his family requested hold a Thanksgiving service in the Anglican Church, overseen by my father. But 60 years on, this type of interreligious relations that transcend mere coexistence is almost unimaginable in Nigeria. And this leads me to my two central questions for this presentation, namely, how did indigenous traditions cultivate this ethos of religious cooperation for the good of the general community? And how did they ever say it so quickly? How did traditional religion and traditional culture form the basis of communal power and authority in Nigeria? In pre-colonial times, Islam and Christianity spread so rapidly, the religious traditions were not understood as conflicting sets of truth claims or dogmatic codes, which demanded universal adherence or conversion. In fact, in the indigenous context, I will compare different traditions to musical instruments in a large orchestra or assembly. There was always room for one more, provided those playing the instrument could learn the music and contribute to the performance, thus elevating the entire group through its presence and unique character. This is the meaning behind the common Yoruba saying in southwestern Nigeria that there are 201 or 401 deities or Orisha in its cosmology. The specific number does not matter. And no matter how large it is, there's always room for one more. In this way, similar traditions could be grouped together like percussion or wind instruments, and they could operate in concert with each other, allowing for dynamic and mutually beneficial interaction. I would like to then examine a set of people and agents that contributed to the thesis I'm trying to propose. Diviners and the divination system. One need not only to look at the role of diviners to see this in action. Practically, every religious tradition in pre-colonial Nigeria had its own systems of divination. And these diviners understood the public practice of this tradition as a public good accessible to all. For example, the most widely spread professional form of divination, called the 16 cowries drew clients from every fact of society and facets of life, regardless of religious affiliation. Be they Muslims, be they Christians, they were all open to this system. Also, Ifa divination system still remained the most central authoritative divination system in West Africa and among the Yorubas particularly. The oral corpus of Ifa, which is used in divination to provide primordial wisdom to clients to solve their existential issues, demonstrate the ecumenical nature of the indigenous cosmology. So Ifa corpus is replete with various interactions of Yoruba deities and so on and so forth. I published about 2 articles where I discussed how Ifa divination narratives describe the Hajj, the Muslim Hajj, in very, very fascinating ways. If we go and then look at medicine men and women, called Onishegu in Yoruba tradition, similarly understood their role as one of the leveraging the deep knowledge of their tradition for the well-being of the entire community. So people of different religious backgrounds, that is, who served a variety of orishas, or they were Muslims or Christians, could master this pharmacological system and work with each other to enhance their knowledge. I remember growing up in southwestern Nigeria and remembering, that most of our grandfathers had a medicine book called Iwe Ogun Odumosu, like the Dictionary of Medicine, that was compiled to contain herbal remedies for different kinds of problems. When we move very quickly to healing, the healing system, it was understood as the use of ashe. Ashe there means a vital force, vital power to restore wellness to the whole human being. Not just what may be called the physical body in the modern West. There's a certain type of ashe in everything that exists. And by gaining access to knowledge of the inherent ashe of plant animals or other materials, one could help them to interact in ways that establish better order for any type of system. We can talk a lot about ashe. The assembly of scholars like you in Berlin, in the Yoruba imagination, they will constitute an ashe, a kind of authority that is commonly defined and imposed on others that belong to that community or the Ummah. So as a result of this, medicine men and women called Onishebu were afforded great respect based on what type of ashe, power, and authority they had, and the ways in which they acquired it. And this was illicitly known or verified through the efficacy of their action and the ability to improve the life of the community around them. Recently, I have started interviewing a 98-year-old medicine man in southwestern Nigeria. And I will say to you, seeing is believing. Let me talk a little bit about the phenomenology of ashe, which I have translated as power, authority, or divine energy. Both collective and individual people constitute ashe. You often hear ashe Olorun, the power and authority of God. Ashe Orisha, the power and authority of deities. Ashe Oba, the power and the authority of the king, or even the elders. There's the ashe of the city, and various groups of universities, of religion and civil order. So the idea is that ashe is conveyed through this medium and carries with it the power to effect change and make things happen. So literally, the matter of ashe, when it is physically constructed, when it is invoked, it makes things happen. It's not as in the Christian or Islamic tradition of prayer, may it please God for this thing to be so. It simply means it is going to be so. It is compulsive. It is not persuasive. And of course, the Yorubas feel that the ultimate power and ashe lies with the sacred king, the Oba, that is regarded as the custodians of tradition and the guidance of the faith, and also the protector of his own people. If you take the time to look at several of the books that have been published on African indigenous religion, particularly Yoruba religion, will find how effectively this phenomena has been described and how in practice it's sustained among the people. The next, of course, is the tradition of sacred kingship. So that while individual members of the society could engage the beneficial ashe of powerful or authoritative practitioners of individual groups, religious or otherwise, this was not quite enough to form a cohesive community, communal identity. And this is where sacred kingship comes. I have spent quite a lot of time talking about sacred kingship in Yoruba religious tradition. My book, The City of 201 Gods, and my first book, Religion, Kingship and Rituals in a Yoruba Community in Ondo, really described it. The key issue here is the term, is when the king is described as Alashe Ekeji Orisha. The guardian of Ashe, the owner and wielder of power, akin to that of the gods. That's why the sacred king is regarded as a deity in the Yoruba system. Consequently, the Oba's Ashe flows from a plurality of sources, and in a fascinating way, is expected to be used for the good of all and all the stakeholders. However, if there seems to be little agential power flowing from the office that sets the community in better order, it means something is wrong with the natural flow of Ashe. It's also very interesting that there are checks and balances in the traditional system that allows the community through its privy court to pronounce on the king. This is very important because as we look at the modern political system, those checks and balances, even when they are written into it, they are not obeyed. Yesterday, I was listening to a speech given by a prominent Nigerian in discussing the crisis in Sokoto in northern Nigeria at this point. And the bottom line thing is that a lot of the institutions that are put in place to serve as checks and balances have failed. This is precisely how I would like to theorize the sorry state of African nation building today, following independence perhaps because the notion of Ashe or its equivalent in other traditional society was so ubiquitous. National leaders both established political action and discourse on its basis, but never thought to integrate it explicitly into political structures the way they did the legacy of Christianity and Islam. And I can give quite a number of examples there. What is also interesting is to ask the question that why is it that in countries like Senegal, Leopold Senghor was able to serve as a president in an overwhelmingly Muslim Senegal, or Amadou Ahidjo, a Muslim, could be the first president of predominantly Christian Cameroon. If they possessed and could wield enough Ashe, including from their own personal tradition, this was what mattered most, not the source of that Ashe as it pertains to other sources like Christianity and Islam. So rather than leveraging the unique abilities and power of each community for the good of a national identity of community, the goal of politics in the African state slowly shifted towards a competition for a national cake and the control of the soul of the nation. This is what we are seeing in some of the crises between Christians and Muslims all over Africa today. And Nigeria, of course, is a major place that we can reference in our conversation. If we adopt the Yoruba notion of Ashe as a lens of analysis, it is clear that the current state of affairs in Africa, weak or failed state, certainly indicates why we are in this mess. It is because national government lacks real legitimacy among the people, even if they have a great fear of its power, given their repeated demonstration that they are unwilling or incapable of wielding it for the common good. So the point I'm trying to make here is that we have to begin to look at these alternative forms of authority. Africans must go back to their roots. I am not saying that people who have become Christians and Muslims should now convert to indigenous religion and so. That's not what I'm saying here. But what I'm saying is that they have to begin to look at their sources of power and authority and those things that made life at least possible for their ancestors. My argument is that one way out of this current predicament is to mine indigenous traditions for a new articulations of authority and power and invoke them rather than imported forms of authority and power that that have not really served any use for us. And being a Christian and even the son of an Anglican priest myself, I have nothing against adherents of Abrahamic traditions. And in fact, by adopting indigenous African notions of power and authority, we should embrace them for what they can offer us. And instead, I propose that we correct the mistake of some of our greatest and earliest national leaders by not taking indigenous traditions for granted, particularly because it is under attack from more fundamentalist and benign ideologies of religion and politics. So my interest is more about the epistemology, the knowledge tradition, the ontological realities, and the metaphysical certainties that come from these traditions. It's less about the profession of faith that emanates from the belief system that Africans have been introduced to. I can go on and on, but in the interest of time, let me move to my conclusion. I must say that in addition to what we have been saying, we can even turn the matter around and suggest that rather than Africans needing to import Western philosophies of governance, a country like the United States will learn a great deal from the Yoruba people. One of my former students recently shared with me a brilliant paper from one of his undergraduates that's conceptualized American voter suppression and gerrymandering as a type of malicious manipulation of political affairs, akin to what is often referred to as witchcraft. In a democracy, each citizen is meant to possess a share through the power to cast a ballot. So when the government tries to impede the exercise of this share, it is invoking its own legislative share in a type of war of exoteric, invisible political power and preys upon its most vulnerable citizens. While scholars generally understand share to be used in the religious sphere, and this is certainly correct, it cut across the religious secular divide and is clearly equally as applicable in Western and secular politics. The overwhelming diversity of contemporary African states and the challenges of the modern era make it absolutely necessary for African forms of politics to change, adapt, and evolve. However, our wholesale appropriation of Western models of governance have not only failed to bear fruit, but have seen our efforts at nation building backslide since the era of independence. When I harken back to this era and the pre-colonial period, I'm not naive enough to suggest that we pretend to be able to travel back in time and reinstitute a perfect, pristine, and uniform indigenous African culture. On the contrary, my deep reference for African tradition is precisely its ability to incorporate the new and useful and rearticulate itself in an appropriate form as dictated by the times. Since, in the Yoruba case, Oduduwa established the tradition of Yoruba sacred kingship many centuries ago. Yoruba culture has gone through massive changes, and yet this form of political organization has proven remarkably durable. To create something new, one must first identify materials that already exist and use them creatively. The legacy created by diviners, medicine men, and medicine women, and the office of the king through their inventive and communitarian use of Ashe constitute an excellent example, indigenous material that serves us well in the pre-colonial, colonial, and early independence periods, and it will. I want to thank the organizers of this conference for considering it important to bring to limelight these kinds of conversation. Forms of authority, indigenous forms of authority that are often overlooked in Western discourse and also in our universities. I joined Harvard in 2006, and I've graduated 12 PhDs who are in very good universities in Europe and America. And I always insist that in writing their PhD thesis, they must take seriously indigenous immunotics. That the traditions that we are studying through historical and ethnographic references are interpretive traditions. They are not simply things you quote or you cite to support what Foucault is saying. You must begin interpretation from that particular place. This also applies from that tradition. This also applies to the theory and the idea that I think we're discussing today. Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Olupona, for this very interesting talk, that I'm very much looking forward to the vivid discussion after the next talk, not now. And I would like to introduce our next speaker, Ms. Almut Schulamit-Bruckstein. She's a thinker, a curator, a theorist, author, and art critic. She's also an author of House of Taswir, sorry. Actually, she brought like books with her. This is, I think, House of Taswir, and she's an author of another book in German, Freund, Talmud, und Taswir. Maybe you are interested in reading it after you purchased it. And the Taswir project is an international platform for artistic research and diasporic forms of thinking. Ms. Bruckstein has held professorships for philosophy and cultural theory in Berlin, Jerusalem, and Basel, and she also curated international exhibitions. Her open work installation, Meine kleine Mnemosyne. Okay, that's complicated written, but in Berlin combines the format of an art and thinking space with the traditions of the salon, the Jewish school, the souk, and the private cabinet. And there she conducts lecture series and talks with guests from multiple fields and disciplines, such as art, philosophy, and psychoanalysis, only to name some. And her paper is on where to begin with, how to build a house of wisdom. So the floor is yours, and we're very much looking forward to your talk.
I don't know if Professor Olupona can still see me. I just wanted to say how honored I am to meet you and to share this panel with you, and how inspiring really your talk was in a very specific sense, because to speak about the inspirations of indigenous political structures and to speak about indigenous sensibilities to multivocal relations and to multivocal communities and how to build them is in a way very much my question too in this paper. And I would love to treat the rabbinic tradition, in fact, as such an indigenous political and literary tradition, and the difficulties really to see that inspiration is very much connected, as you also explained it very, very clearly, to the occupation or grab of the modern, like linear European way of thinking, clear and distinct, and the structures of authority sort of like grabbing or occupying those traditions. So in a way, my presentation is very much related, I think, to what you taught us, and I hope that it will become clear. So thank you very much. I'm grateful to share this with you. So Emily Jacir and Susan Bookmore say past events cannot provide a key to the present unless they are radically separated from a direct lineage of inheritance. And where to begin? The first thing I want to speak about is the withdrawal of tradition past a surpassing disaster, a theorem proposed by the Beirut thinker Jalal Tawfiq. In the year 1979, the Baghdad-born Jewish artist Yosef Sasson Tzemach, who lives and works in Amsterdam, created a series of papers called An Introduction to the Principle of Relative Expression. They were oil paintings on text pages of the Babylonian Talmud, more specifically on folio pages from the tractate Psachim. Yosef Sasson Tzemach is an internationally acclaimed artist, the grandson of HaChacham Sasson Kaduri. HaChacham Sasson Kaduri, the last chief rabbi and head of the Jewish community of Baghdad until the early 1950s, the Resh Galuta, if you wish, if we still want to honor the title given to the head of Baghdadi Talmud Academy ever since the House of Study moved from Pompedita to Baghdad in the year 988 under the direction of the Chai Gaon. The grandfather of Yosef Sasson Tzemach, HaChacham Sasson Kaduri, refused to join the immigration of Jews to Palestine in the 1950s and stayed with the remnants of his community even when his children and grandchildren were leaving. As you can see, the artist covered the central ancient text and the most important medieval commentaries from Troy, Worms, Cairo, and Baghdad with black oil. He creates an opaque screen, hides the Talmudic letters by a flat veil of darkness, and highlights various lines of flight instead. Lines of flight between blocks of commentary, as if to say, yes, this text used to initiate us into diasporic ways of thinking, into theories of relativity, practices of indeterminacy, and atopical dialectics for more than 20 centuries. The text stood at the heart of the Jewish people until the very foundation of the European modern nation-states. But due to the withdrawal of tradition past a surpassing disaster, yes, I'm using this concept of the Beirut artist, thinker, and writer Jalal Tawfiq backwards and forward in time, and we'll explain it later. Due to the withdrawal of tradition past a surpassing disaster, these texts are no longer available to artists and thinkers, possibly ever since the Jew became estranged from the Arab, and surely since the ubiquity, you talked about it, the ubiquity of the Jewish textual homeland got replaced by geopolitical parameters, by the claim that Jews belong to the territory of a modern European nation-state in the Middle East of today. The ubiquity of a textual homeland. Before we may think of Walter Benjamin or George Luis Borges, the expression textual homeland rather resonates with the words of the Arab rabbinic thinker Saadia Gaon, Ein ummatenu ela b'toratenu. We do not have any ummah but Talmud Torah, our script, the text we love. Water. The text we love. But what if that text, that textual homeland, got occupied by doublegangers? What if it is affected by what the Beirut thinker, filmmaker, artist, and writer Jalal Tawfiq calls the withdrawal of tradition past a surpassing disaster? And what does it mean then, the withdrawal of tradition past a surpassing disaster? We don't have much time. I didn't know I have 20 minutes, so I don't know if to read or not to read. I just read a bit from this black book, just a bit. Jalal Tawfiq develops this concept with reference to destructions through war, mass murder, colonial occupation, and events that not only materially destroy people, buildings, and the infrastructures of the community during the time of the disaster, but which have long-lasting effects on the tradition itself, immaterial effects, because members of the community affected by the disaster, writers, artists, filmmakers, and other creative agents, can no longer access the tradition past the surpassing disaster, even when books, libraries, museums, universities, and other material remnants of it are restored or remain materially available. Why is it so difficult? Traditions withdraw immaterially due to an irreparable damage done to the tradition itself. This damage is severed when the tradition gets hijacked or occupied otherwise by those who are not sensitive to its withdrawal and who are therefore endorsing this process, producing look-alikes, doubles, doppelganger, and counterfeits that make it near impossible for the tradition to be resurrected from within. This is from the House of Taswir. How do we enter then? How do we enter a doorway sealed by the doppelganger's mimicry, veiling the act of withdrawal itself? We need transvestite detours to touch upon Jewish tradition, I think. The House of Taswir is born from the realization that occupied literary territory leave their inhabitants in a deadlock of action. We must sidetrack the epistemic poetic architecture of the text we love. And yes, we must transfer the mechanism of the text we love into strange territory. But we must do it with poetic precision. How would we do it? During the last 15 years, I have systematically developed an architectural device, a shibboleth, for the tradition to pass doorways that are sealed by the mimicry of doppelgangers. I have created lines of flight for Talmudic thinking. What did I do? First, I took the very architecture of the Talmudic page and turned its very format into exhibition sketches, straying true to its external form, its dynamic gist, its meandering paths, its sidetracking signifiers, its semantic associative chains. I created object constellations crisscrossing time and space, just as the letters on the ancient page. In these spatial experiments, whether large or small, I simply switched art objects for letters, emulating the Talmudic kinetic moves. So how did I do it? So this is really like a tour de force. I show you a few examples, formal examples. This is, of course, a classical page from the Talmud. And what I'm interested in is the relationship between margin and center, and the way you actually, that the central text is so infinitely studied over and over that it becomes sort of a question to anyone dealing with it. So in a way, you always go outside in. This is a hadith sharing the same structure. I'm interested solely at the moment in the architecture of the place, of the page. And I'm interested in the gaps and the fissures between the letters, the white ink, if you may say so, and the way how the margin actually sort of meanders inside the text, like wherever it can sort of squeeze itself in. Here it's very physical. Yeah, you read from the margin and you create almost like fabric of reading that is ubiquitous in many places and also has really a vertical, like a simultaneity of time in one page. So you see that actually in the 20th century, Max Ernst tried to solve a problem of infinity with some mathematician interestingly called Tempel. This is the name of the mathematician. And they tried to solve a problem of infinity where Max Ernst actually invented his own typography of letters because he thought that the letters are so misused by legibility that everyone thinks we know what we are seeing, that he created a whole typography of letters that are illegible on first view. then I started sort of transferring this architecture to exhibitions. I created an exhibition in Martin Gropiusbau where actually my 18 rooms all around became the text and the inner court became the margin, so I sort of inversed it. Yeah, you can see this, I could explain it, there's not much time, but maybe later. And of course, Abi Warburg in the 1920s in Hamburg did the very same thing. He talked about displacing the objective constellations, turned it and turned it, everything is in it. You can see how he did it, right? It's like pathos formulas, gestures that he could sort of present in constellations, like where time becomes simultaneous, where the linear timeline is no longer in power. You can see how Georges Didier Huberman actually focused and created object constellations of his own. And in the Mishnah it says, turn it and turn it, everything is in it. It means every single letter you can create an object constellation of its own. I did exhibitions where this Mishnah actually figured very centrally. There you can see it in German, Drehes, everything is in it. Lady Dada Kalam, I connected 10th century atomism with Dada. so this was a citation there. There you can see the Talmudic page in an Istanbul biennial exhibition that I curated 2 years ago. So you can see Mered Oppenheim in the middle with a snake that has no beginning nor end, and you see sort of the four corners of the commentary centering around it. Here you can see the same hadith, and I repeated it in Çanakkale in another biennial exhibition where you have a whole margin of commentary flowing and sort of floating around this very old building of the Jewish quarter of Çanakkale. Okay, this was a tour de force. There's a second thing. There's a second way. A second way, besides the architectural shibboleth, to stay faithful to the text we love. The second way pertains to the performative gestures traditionally related to the assembly of scholars or the house of study. What scene of knowledge do we see there? Who is speaking when and how in the house of study? Given the withdrawal of tradition past a surpassing disaster, how do we transfer then not only the epistemic architecture of the page, but also the performative gestures intimately related to the act of study? How do we do it? I need one more detour to make the point. We start somewhere else, and by that we enter the threshold to things I'm presently occupied with. Last point, not long ago, I came across a stunning letter of Karl Abraham, founding father of psychoanalysis in Berlin. The letter is dated May 11, 1908. It is addressed to Sigmund Freud. Abraham writes to Freud, "Surely the Talmudic way of thinking cannot at all or at once have vanished from us. Die talmudische Denkweise kann doch nicht plötzlich aus uns verschwunden sein. The methods of psychoanalysis, Freud and Abraham agree, demand at least a faint physical memory of what Abraham calls the Talmudic way of thinking. However, Freud hastens to add, psychoanalysis should by no means to be taken as a Jewish affair. Abraham and Freud rather seem to point to a specific practice or habit of thinking, a pathos formula, a performative gesture, tossing and turning around letters and words, knowing how to touch them, to trace them, mirror them, conflate, cut, veil, or unveil them, undoing referential regimes, unhinging grammar, sidetracking metaphors, proceeding from outside in, from answer to question in a typically Talmudic flow of free associations, taking one's cue from wordplays, semantic hides and seeks, triggered by the imagination, by desire, fear, and dreams. The ancient masters refer to this play traditionally by the name of a love toy, Toratisha Ashuai. The text we love needs two to unravel. It must be spoken out in a loud voice. It works like a dream image, unfolding its secrets in the stories arising with it. exposed by sidetracking thoughts, by unexplored tangents. Jouissance is the rendering of Sha'ashua into French coined by those who still remember the Talmud. Let's not forget the Talmud. Is this then the subtext of the small booklet, Let's Not Forget Psychoanalysis, published with 4 essays of Jacques Derrida in 1980? Let's not forget the Talmud. Let's not forget the Sha'ashua of the ancient masters, their jouissance. What I'm presently doing is to develop a performative manual for a nomadic, indigenous, maybe, house of study faithful to the ancient jouissance. A performative grammar of forms, contemporary ancient, to be precise. What are these forms? What kind of performative grammar makes up the house of Taswir? This ephemeral, nomadic, collective house of study we love to create. I call them by their name, the forms. Chavruta, scribe or commentary, Tish. So now another tour de force. I have no time to do this, but there are 3 forms and I actually decline it like a grammar. It's a performative grammar, but it has the theory of mimicry. It's a reverse mimicry. The Chavruta, you can see here, I had a golden couch in my exhibition, and I have a Mimuzune small place where the host and guest meets for a 50-minute or an hour talk. The main thing is that there's no theme to begin with. It needs a free, meandering, associative way of speaking, and it creates its own particular, very, very local kind of curriculum. It's an inductive way of doing things, a point that unfolds, not like a universal thing, a point that unfolds. And the point is not known in the beginning. It evolves from who you meet. It's the power of adhesion in a way, the power of touch. You see it here. I did another exhibition. It was called Orangerie. And you see the scribe is a very, very central figure. The scribe is important because we know that intimacy needs opacity. So how the scribe, who's the commentator, how can he be faithful to the intimacy of the couple studying? Like, we know that surveillance is a problem. We know that, what is the art of writing under the condition of surveillance? So this is what I did in other spatial exercises. This is the scribe writing a mural poetry while the couple is speaking, not exactly knowing exactly what's being spoken. So you can see the third form is the Tish, of course, the Tish of the assembly of scholars, starting with a very specific object constellation. So it's creating a curriculum that is in a way idiosyncratic, and it's not prescribed. And it's not known beforehand. This is why you can't do it in a university very easily, because you don't say in the beginning of the semester what's the curriculum. You only can write it backwards. And I can tell you this is my Tisch University. It's a Salon University, a Wohnzimmer University. I found it a year ago. And so it sort of creates its curriculum backward. Only in the end you know what the beginning was. So it's I feel it's in a way very similar to what we heard before. And you have to start with many things on your table. Yeah, this is sort of sources that are separate, that are heterogeneous. And of course, you need collaborative action. That's in a way a miracle. The miracle is that you can be yourself the center of the activity. But the beautiful thing is when it happens the other way around, when all of a sudden you feel that there's an invitation coming from the house of Taswir that I didn't know about. So this is what happened last month in Kampala with a group of artists. Very, very unexpected that there was an invitation extended to me to join their exhibition that was inspired by this kind of architecture, very specifically. This was a curator's team. You can see Molke Hadjalem from Tunis, from Budapest, Julia Gehmann. Then there's Huda Al-Janabi from Baghdad, Friedrich Ruf, Huma Sherzai from Kabul. So this was a group of of ladies curators, I sort of assembled for an exhibition in Berlin. There was this Lady Dada Kalam exhibition. So really a powerful team. Istanbul, etc., etc. And then it has an agenda in the public art magazine, so it can unfold in very unexpected ways. Questioning the great authority of geographies, right? An atlas I once did. So this is basically the second tour de force to all these examples. And yes, thank you very much. Thanks, really. Thanks for your kind attention. And thanks, Mohammed, for talking about the book, because it really is a kind of how to build. Thank you.
I think the best would be if you stay at the front.
Yeah, okay, maybe.
And then we will have a discussion with the audience. But first, I would like to give Professor Olupona the opportunity to maybe react or to comment on what you have said, and also vice versa, if you want to. I
would love to see you in person, really. It's like, but I can imagine, yes. Now I see you. Yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
That's lovely. Yes.
Yes, I must say that I'm very delighted and pleased to hear Professor Brockenstein talk. I am surprised somehow that there are quite a number of similarities between our thesis and what we have been able to do. I'm also surprised because most African scholars work under the illusion that the West presents almost a kind of a universalist position.
Right.
So listening to you, even querying other traditions that are sort of outside your own framework and tradition is quite a surprise to me. But I think one of the things I'm going to leave this place with today is the letter you cited from Abraham to Freud.
Yes.
Talking about the Talmudic way of thinking, the fact that we cannot just assume that everything should be, if you like, secular or non-religious, but without, there must be a minimal framed memory of a Talmudic way of, of being, or epistemology. And this is very important to me because it comes at the root of the crisis that I just mentioned.
Yes.
The idea that African scholars have been placed in a totally inferior position, that they do not see anything good in their own indigenous tradition.
Yes.
And this has become a problem. And in fact, it's so bad that even in the United States, when they're trying to look for scholars and they intervene and all these things, whoever is not able to, to construct reality in the Western sense or so, is seen as primitive or even out of tune with reality. This is something that we have encountered. I feel that, well, I'm 71 years old now. I would love to see something very different, but I know it may not happen in my lifetime. And then when we now translate it to the political order and the systems, and particularly the so-called democratic system, and we find out that Africans, political scientists and scholars and so, they are more in tune with Western democratic system. They can talk about the German system and the British system, and when they are given the opportunity to take the lead in constructing something for their own community, this is where they go to. And I think this is part of the problem. Of course, I realize that it's going to take me some time to read your paper because it's very, very technical. But I have deep appreciation for what you have given us. I can sort of say more. I try to see if I can get down some notes, but I am very pleased and appreciative of your scholarship and the paper you presented to us. Thank you.
If I may take up, I mean, yes, thank you. Yeah, it's like, I mean, we do have traditions of critiquing the modus of universal thinking in the so-called West. I mean, we have a deconstructive sort of postmodern tradition. We have fractal thinking, we have diffractions, we have atomism. Sort of, we discover ways of breaking the linear, clear and distinct ways of how the European thinks. But what I didn't realize is, of course, there's a very similar difficulty, maybe, between the indigenous traditions you speak about and the ancient, like, non-European versions of rabbinic tradition, for example, that might no longer be available. So I also found that this is a very interesting connection, maybe for future research or future questions. How is that connection exactly in terms of the method of retrieving it? No, I mean, we don't usually think of it, and that's very interesting, I think, for future, maybe future connections and relationships also. So it's a lot of, has to do with the power of community also, who's working with who. I mean, who's sort of supporting or enhancing whose scholarship. I mean, it's, in the end, it's relationships. You talked about the assembly of scholars. Yes.
Yeah. I should mention to you what I told the medicine man that I'm working with. He remembered that my father, in 1960, who was a priest in his hometown, had tried to convert him to Christianity. I wrote a book in memory of my parents in my father's parsonage, the story of an Anglican family. And he saw the photograph. He said, oh, this is Reverend Olupona. He tried to convert me, but now, Professor, I am now a Christian. He's been blackmailed into conversion.
Yes.
So I told him that, Baba, you know what? God has decided to keep you alive and to keep me alive so that this conversation that we're having will take place. It's probably going to take a couple of months for me to finish it. It will be a book, ultimately similar to the Grenouille's book, Conversation with Ogoto Melo, the story of the Dogon medicine man that the French anthropologist interviewed. So I told him that it's also providential what is going on. That is my understanding of it. So in other words, even in our interpretation or even if it's pure phenomenology of tradition we are studying, there is always a room for us to think about, the process. And he was very happy to see that. And let me tell you, every sentence that I heard from him is very new, is unbelievable. They belong to what the West in general have called magic for a long time, because whatever they cannot understand and interpret, they call magic. And when I remind them that, look, the tradition of mysticism in Judaism and Islam and so, this is very profound. It's not, why don't they call it magic? And then someone reminded me, well, you need to know that the fundamentalists are very much opposed to what the Tariqas are doing, and they too brand them as pagans, just like Africans who have not converted to Islam and Christianity. So it is fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, yes. Maybe, yeah. Do you?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we can open the floor for questions. And we have already one colleague who promised me he would go around with the mic, is not there.
Thank you very much. First of all, Professor Olupona, I'd like to thank you really for joining us for this conference. We're delighted that you're here. We'd like to see you. We'd love to see you in person, but we're delighted to see you also here on screen. And of course, thank you, Almut Schulmit, for being here. I'm trying to see again convergences between your two presentations, and one convergence that struck me immediately is the focus on simultaneity. Professor Olupona, you spoke about incorporating new traditions while at the same time returning to roots. There's no better way to articulate simultaneity than in this image of incorporation, which returns in Shulamit Almut's presentation as collaboration and as a simultaneity of text. I'm trying to think how this relates to authority. And one thing that came to me as I listened to you and saw your images, and that the idea of the tish, that the tish is a tish without beginning.
Yes.
And we often think of authority as being associated with beginnings, the Greek arche, right? Authority and beginning at the same time. But by dissociating authority from beginning, what happens is that authority kind of emerges in the aftermath. We don't know who is the authority. We don't know what authority really begins, but it emerges. And there's no better way of complicating the idea of authority than actually deferring the authority of authority as it emerges in the reverse. Right? It's
Beautiful.
this kind of Rosenzweigian new
Right.
thinking of authority. So I wanted to see whether that is something that's intentional as you relate your own thinking, respective thinkings to authority.
Wow, beautiful question. Professor Olupona, do you want to? Because
Well,
it's
I
a-
guess that is. I can respond to the first part on convergences between tradition. You see, we have to put it in historical context. After the search of the missionary movement, when the European evangelical churches were established in Africa, we moved to the era of African independent churches. Those are men of authority and power who rebelled against European Christianity and decided on their own to start their own churches and so. And that became almost the golden era of African Christianity, you know. But what really is important about it is the idea of how they were able to match these two traditions together. They didn't make away with European evangelical Christianity, so to say. They transformed it and began to, to practice it in their own ways, in the context of this new tradition, of their own indigenous tradition. In fact, the Catholics were so jealous of what happened that the term enculturation began to, be very important to the Catholics, where Christianity was now reframed to reflect African sensibility, African culture, and African tradition. So so in other words, the old was not totally destroyed. New emerged, but there was a kind of a continuity and convergences, in that. So we're able to trace the common threads in all these things. In fact, I can demonstrate even in the use of music or even arts, how these convergences sort of occurred. However, what is going on today is a new form of Pentecostal charismatic churches that is virtually spoiling everything for the Africans.
If I may, Asher, thank you very much, because you brought, you threw light on a connection that I haven't realized. Because you said that I dissociate authority from beginnings, and that's very true. That's what I said. But so to summarize it like this means we both have a fable for Hermann Cohen's theory of non-foundations, and in a way to celebrate anarchy, in a sense of sort of starting with no beginning, blima, with the kind of creatio ex nihilo, that's the act of sort of starting with the infinitesimal nothing that comes from the question of the other, right? The other is sort of that kind of nothing that invites my response. So it's true. So what happens if you actually start a discussion at a table of scholars, assembly of scholars and artists with this kind of nothingness of the linear curriculum? You create a kind of, if not multiverse, a kind of like a subversive universe of learning. And I mean, it's only the power of how much you can do, but in a way, it's an atomist way of distribution, or of sort of it celebrates a kind of simultaneity also of the tissues, right? Sort of you have in a way you're building a community, and the kind of learning around these tissues is very intense because you take seriously every single position at the table. You don't start with territory of fields. So, and it's really sort of the universities always have the territory to begin with, like the state. It was not so much a political critique of military occupation, what I presented, but the very principle of territorial order of knowledge. That's the point. So the university has actually territories of fields to begin with. So if you do a trans or interdisciplinary project, you have those territories to begin with, which I don't. In my Tisch, I invite scholars who, in a way, idiosyncratically, who I love. So it means it becomes a table of desire. The desire for the other is very central. I'm not ashamed. I don't apologize. And that means I have people there of very different fields, and a quorum of 10, say. And then you create a curriculum that is so densely worked. The poetry and the desire sort of creates community. And if you do this not only at your own table, but maybe at Asher's table, or at Professor Olupona's table, right? And then you have a kind of universe of learning, a small one, minimalist, that works by jumps, by leaps. It's a leaping way of thinking. And that is the Talmudic way of thinking. So it means we might call it an indigenous way of thinking, because it shares the same problems that Professor Olupona described. It's like, how does it survive the universal grip of the theorems of modernity, which I mean the Cartesian, like clear and distinct, the territorial order of things. So this is basically the experiment, and it has to start with the Chavruta, because the à deux, I call the form à deux, is where the desire or the connection is being built. That means any couple, any point, any kind of, point is also a nothing, we learned from Hermann Cohen, can become a small world, right? So this is basically the principle of the House of Taswir. That means that's also the reason why it's nomadic. It can't be, it's always where it happens. You talked about it before, yeah? It's where it happens, and it's not mystical. It's exactly the way it works. So, yeah, thank you. Asher, thank you.
Yeah, please, we have two questions. You first, and then.
Thank you for both papers. They were fascinating. I had two questions for Professor Olupona. You have interviewed the Oni of Ife and discussed his own Christianity. I was curious how you saw the Oni and the current Oni balancing their Christianity with their traditional responsibilities, and what concepts you saw them drawing on to make sense of that balance. The second question I had was, do you see a concept like Ashe, obviously not by name, but a similar concept active in Pentecostal churches insofar as you have Buhari going to the Redeemed Camp to get blessing, you have Muslims going to get prayed for by Pentecostals, and there's a sense of power and efficaciousness that's still active, though not by name?
I didn't realize a scholar of Nigerian religion is here. Okay, thank you very much. It's a fascinating. You're taking me back to my territory. Huh? The late Oni Oshijuade Olubose was like a father to me, very close. He, of course, took tradition seriously, but he was also very open to Christianity and Islam. He was given a Muslim name, for example, in addition to his names when he was born, because his grandfather was a Muslim, and was also able, because of his own deep knowledge of tradition and custom, able to do some kinds of balancing act, which favored his people. The current Oni is younger, is very, very young, and is trying his best to also do similar things. But what is also interesting is that we're dealing with a situation where the religious changes that have occurred have in fact affected not only the status quo, but also what happens today. One of our young scholars, Professor Obadari, wrote a book, and I'm responding to that on Saturday at the conference, what he calls the Pentecostal Republic. With Pentecostalism, there's a more pronounced interest in the charismatic Pentecostal prayers, prophecy, and so on and so forth. And it is very difficult for whoever is the Oni of a king not to respond to what we may probably call a religious fashion today. However, the concept of Ashe itself, you will find in the vocabulary of the Pentecostal folks. They will talk about Olorun Ashe, as if they're also invoking that same power, vital force, and vital power to act. They know the meaning of it. They know the importance of it. They also try to harness it in their own theology. It's going to take some time to know what is going on, but the current Oni acknowledges also the importance of these three traditions. The Yorubas will say Oba Oni Gbogbo Esin, the king, the sovereign, the custodian of the three traditions. But what is also interesting about it, and this is going to be the last statement I made, is that religion in the hands of scholars like us, like you, it's a science. We can historically and culturally see what has transformed and changed. What we are seeing today, unlike my first work on the Ondo society, where I argued strongly for the presence of a civil religion, where the king was the sacred canopy under which these other traditions were subsumed. What we are seeing today is very different. The kings and the obas are going to the camps of the Pentecostal and kneeling before them. That's a very big change. So you can imagine someone who is conceived to be a god, an Orisha, now going to what? Going to a higher god, an Orisha. So the Pentecostal priests, in some way, have also assumed the role of, of priest, but a new form of authority that trumps traditional indigenous authority. I hope I have made sense here.
Thank you for the two brilliant papers. I have a question for Shulamit about the everyday things and basically the everyday in the house of Tasvir. And just to elaborate a little bit on this, is it out? Sorry. Because one example, this room, now it's very special. It's like in a castle. In 3 hours, it's maybe just an empty room. Or if I'm reading a sacred text and there is coffee next to it, and of course there's a sacred text, and what is the coffee? And I don't know if you understand where I want to go. And when I looked at the pictures you brought to us, where it was very, there was this tenderness in how things are positioned, and not just because it's a very special table, it's a very special guest, it's a very special book, but and inspired by the way you perform the Talmud of the paratext and all the other. What is the everyday, and how do you? What is the everyday in Tasvir? Thank you.
Well, this is you know, I mean, not Tom Sawyer. We have worked together. I had the pleasure and working with the Simon Weil Denk Collective in the House of Tasvir, and we actually did joined essay in this public art magazine in Istanbul. I showed you one example, because one of the things is when you have a tish with an interesting agenda that is only clear in the very end, of course it needs a future. Yeah, it needs sort of, it always needs a next chapter. So we actually transferred or transformed exhibitions in the public in situ writing in an Istanbul art magazine that actually appears in public. So we have done work together there. So this is like how Tom is connected to Tasvir, very actively. But you ask a very beautiful question, because if you see the Tish, where the assembly of scholars take place, there's a very specific way we arrange the Tish. There's always chai, a lot of chai. There's sweets. There are nuts and all sorts of, so there's always something to nash. We are nashing. There's a material sweetness to the table. So it's not that eating and learning is separate. So it's of course what the Hasidic Tish does, right? That actually the learning is part of the meal on Shabbat. But here it's really the kind of jouissance of learning that calls for this kind of treat. So it means we stay on. I mean, like here also, I think the hosts of this conference have done it exactly that way, right? You sort of go from enjoying the discussions to eat together and to celebrate and spend the evening, etc. So this is a very, very important aspect. So the everyday is very much connected to contingencies, to adhesion. Adhesion I call who you meet, even by chance. Even by chance. I mean, the faculty, I call it faculty, of the House of Tasvir is something very porous. It means there's no formal way of forming it. I can meet someone on the street and find someone very interesting, and then, yeah, all of a sudden there's a kind of adhesion to the faculty, and then the day after I would call it faculty. And so it's a very informal, without contracts, so to speak. And it includes positions, scholarly positions, and artworks. That means we also have an art space where we have actually, I don't know, like 50 artworks. That there's a kind of economy to it. It's a non-profit legal body also, but in a way, sort of the artists support each other. That means in this art space, everything is available. That means my guests could at any time fall in love with an artwork and like purchase it or buy it, and then I'm interested in where it goes. I'm interested in the desire that moves objects. So instead of asking where does an object come from, yeah, sort of the question of provenance, where do you really come from? I ask the object always, where does it go when someone falls in love and moves it from my own art space? And then I go and sort of with my filmmaker, and I'm interested in the new constellation. So I'm interested really in this Warburgian Schieben der Gestelle, sort of the displacement of the, it's a Warburgian project. This is why it's called Meine kleine Mnemosyne. It's really a Warburg project. But the Warburgian scholars don't know it, right? So because of my very strategic displacement of the discussion itself. Yeah, so it means I think I can stay faithful to the Talmudic way of thinking, but I pay a high price because the people who are familiar with the material will not be the ones who will who will consume it. You see, sort of, I miss out on the recognition of or the transmission. I don't know yet how to continue it into the next generation. It's very difficult. Yeah, if you So, but the everyday is, the contingency is very important. Thank you, Tom. Yes.
Hello, there we go. Thank you both so much for your talks. They were both very interesting and insightful. My question is for Dr. Bruchstein. I really found fascinating your usage of this sort of architectural way of reasoning and your engagement with text through that sort of motif. This is something that also interests me. Which is why, when you mentioned Hermann Cohen, who I read with Asher, I was wondering, and forgive me if this question is too obscure, it was just something that grabbed me, and I would love to have you respond to it. But Cohen, in his Religion of Reason, when he's sort of critiquing idolatry and the making of an image, he says that this by no means suppresses the artistic impulse, right? Particularly of the prophets he's speaking of here. And he gives two exceptions of what the sort of forbiddance of imagery sort of does not affect. And he says poetry
No, of course.
and
Yes.
architecture.
Yeah.
And he places these two together, right? And I was just wondering if that was somewhere in the back of your mind, and if not, I would love to hear you respond to that.
Well,
Thank you.
I feel so blessed that you are bringing up things that actually are probably in the very DNA. No, not DNA. The kind of, this is probably where it comes from, actually. Yes, and I forgot, because I studied Hermann Cohen's aesthetics in the 80s or 90s in Jerusalem when I was with Asher in Jerusalem, with a very huge Talmudic rabbinic scholar that we had both the privilege to study with. So, of course, Hermann Cohen speaks about poetry and architecture, and this is exactly, I forgot. So I thank you very much, because these are the two artistic expressions which actually escape idolatry, which I call the occupation of, the grip of the Doppelgänger, of the territorial way of thinking, and poetry because of the gaps that are between, that you have to leap, and this is the word of Hermann Cohen describing poetry, and architecture too. Yeah, architecture is very difficult to, I mean, the process of building a house is not easily given to idolatrous territorial reading. So thank you very much. It's very much at the heart of the project, and yes, thank you.
There may be one last question. Or? Otherwise, I think we have already reached, unfortunately, the end of our evening here. I would like to thank you again, our two speakers, Dr. Bruchstein and Professor Olupona.
Thank you.
And of course, our audience here and our audience at home, virtually, whom I cannot see. But anyhow, we are going to proceed to the socializing part of the event, and the others just switch off the computer, probably. So yeah,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Of course, for the
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay.
Warm wishes to our colleague, yes.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.